Hello, I'm Stephan Schwartz. Welcome to Schwartz Report. Today I want to talk about something that has really been weighing on my mind. For the first time in my life, I actually fear for my country. I'm not sure that American democracy is going to survive, and I find that just incredibly disturbing. I think some form will survive, that what they call an anocracy, that is, their elections, a Congress, but the substance of fair elections in which every citizen has the right to vote and every vote is counted, I'm not sure that that's going to survive. And it's going to be up to us, you and me, as to whether that does. Otherwise, we're going to get as rigged as Putin has rigged Russia, or as any oligarch has or dictator has rigged his country, the Soviet Union under Stalin, Germany under Hitler. Democracies are not easy to maintain. The fact that the U.S. has done it for more than 2 centuries, I think, is historically amazing. And I know that I'm not alone in that. And I also know that I'm not alone in being deeply concerned about the health of our democracy. Just consider this. In June of 2021, 100 of the leading scholars of American democracy, these are men and women whose professional job is studying the health of democracy, issued a statement that they all signed. I'm going to put it up and I'll read it to you. We, the undersigned, are the scholars of democracy who have watched the recent deterioration of U.S. elections and liberal democracy with growing alarm. Specifically, we have watched with deep concern as Republican-led state legislatures across the country have in recent months proposed or implemented what we consider radical changes to core electoral procedures in response to unproven and intentionally destructive allegations of a stolen election. Collectively, these initiatives are transforming several states into political systems that no longer meet, think about this, that no longer meet the minimum conditions for free and fair elections. Hence, our entire democracy is now at risk. You just think about that. When I read that, I felt confirmed in my own feelings, but I also felt I have never seen anything like that in my entire life. On my daily web publication, schwartzreport.net, I have been telling my readers for years now that the Republican Party is actively and explicitly working to sabotage democracy in America. And I want to be clear about something here. I've said this before in other podcasts, but I really want to be very clear. My position is not political, at least not in terms of partisanship. I don't care about political parties. What I care about is well-substantiated facts and things that people do that promote and foster well-being. The political part I see from the perspective of anthropology. And my calculation is, as I said, do the policies of a particular party produce objectively verifiable well-being? So what worries me is not the Republican politicians, as awful as I find some of them, Matt Gaetz, Ron Johnson, Jim Jordan, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Louis Gohmert, dozens of others. I still find it amazing that 147 Republicans voted to overturn the 2020 election results and have faced really no consequences. So what really concerns me is that the problem facing America is Americans. Politicians draw their glow and power from the populace who elected them. They are manifestations as much as sources, and they know that. They're very clear about who that voted for them and what those people expect them to do. And it is particularly threatening to the nation's well-being that about a third of Americans believe they would be happy in a white supremacy, authoritarian, Christo-fascist state. They pay lip service to democracy, but they don't have real interest in its substance and are psychophysically, pathologically detached from a fact-based reality. The Washington-based Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, surveyed over 5,500 adults in all 50 states over 2 weeks in early 21, March. And they found, this is just, it's astonishing that over 30 million Americans believe in the QAnon's most outrageous conspiracy. Now, I want you to take a look at this before I get right to that. Look at this chart. Now, you think that it's about Republicans and Democrats. But as you can see in this chart, what has actually happened is that about 25% are Republican and 25% are Democrat. But most people, almost half, consider themselves independents now. That means that the form of democracy, two-party democracy that we have had, is coming apart, and that people no longer associate it with it. But this is the thing that PRR found that I just don't know what to make of this. They found that over 30 million Americans believe in QAnon's most outrageous conspiracy, and that is that the government, the media, and the financial worlds in the U.S. are controlled by a group of Satan-worshiping pedophiles which run a global child sex trafficking operation. Really? That's really what 30 million Americans believe? How is it possible that such drivel is believed to be true by that many millions of Americans? What happened to the United States? How are we going to protect democracy? Well, I think there are 6 trends that have brought us to this point, and that's really what I want to focus on. The first, I'll call the provincial trend. We are the richest, most influential nation in the world, and yet 64% of Americans have never been outside the borders of the United States. They have no real conception of what such a racist, authoritarian, fascist state would be like, or what totalitarianism does to a culture, the general society. We are, in fact, as Americans, extraordinarily provincial. And again, such a statement may seem political, but it should really be seen anthropologically. It's a fact. A survey conducted in 2019 by one poll found that 11% of respondents had never left the state in which they were born, and 54% said that they have visited fewer than 10 states. So a majority of Americans have never been outside of America, have no idea what the kind of country that the far right is trying to turn us into. 11% have never even left the state they were born in, and 54% said they've visited fewer than 10 states. So we're not very informed about what life is like in other countries or even other states. And as I have said before in an earlier episode of Schwartz Report, we are going through what I call the Great Schism trend. That is, we are splitting into two countries in one nation, those controlled by the Republicans and those controlled by the Democrats. Now, the second trend, I'm going to call this the low IQ, low information trend. The average IQ in the United States is 98. And in the red value states particularly, it tends to be lower. IQ measurement is controversial, but it is a measure taken everywhere by consistent instruments, so it can be compared. And here is a chart of what the distribution of IQ looks like. So what you can see immediately is that 34% of the population of America are between 98, 100, and 85. Over a third have IQs between 100 and 85. 14% more are between 85 and 70. Think about that. Almost half the country has an IQ between 85 and 70, which is retarded. And I'm very familiar with that because for 30 years, I supported my retarded autistic brother. And I'm very aware and grew up with a very severely handicapped brother. So it takes a lot of work to educate and get across to people. And we're not doing what we need to do to get people to understand what's going on. How does this manifest? Well, combine that distribution with this fact that even though the rate of high school completion is as high as it's ever been before, 10% of adult Americans have still not completed high school. So that's tens of millions of people have never completed high school. And even those with higher education have an extraordinary blankness about the most basic knowledge of our government. Now look at this one. In a survey by the Annenberg Public Policy Center, only 32% of Americans were correctly able to name all three branches of government. And a third could not name any branch of government. Judicial, legislative, executive, they didn't know that. They could not name even one branch, and only 32% could name all three. Why? Because we're not teaching civics anymore. We have not made the teaching of civics a significant part of the education of children. And so they don't know. And if you don't know, how can you possibly properly assess? Thomas Jefferson saw this problem at the country's founding. He wrote a letter to his friend Charles Yancey, and he said, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. So the founders, Benjamin Franklin said something similar. The founders understood we need as a country to emphasize and make important in schools how a democracy operates, how the country is set up. Because if we can't get that across to people, how can they possibly make decisions about what they understand and support? Given the attempted insurrection we witnessed in January 6th, it's one of the coincidences that charm historians, by the way, that Jefferson's letter is dated 6 January 1816. Let me go to the third trend that I see, the social media trend. I talked about this at great length in an earlier episode, but I want to come back to it because it's so important. What Jefferson could not see is what today has become, I think, one of the greatest threats to our American democracy: social media and the weaponization of misinformation. For most of the American history, the world Jefferson knew, and what everybody knew until about the 70s, early 80s, was that what passed for social media was called rumors, and they were passed around in bars and barber shops and dining rooms, living rooms, beauty parlors, and brothels. There was no concept by the founders that you were going to be able to carry around a little instrument in your pocket that would allow you to be constantly pulsed with misinformation that would lead you to believe the most outrageous things. And yet we know that kids are spending on average 4.8 hours a day looking at media, adults similar or even more. Only 5% of teenagers still read newspapers. Most people get information now through social media, and a very large percentage of it is wrong. The world of Facebook and X and LinkedIn and TikTok and Instagram and a host of others has emerged, and it's doing us no favors, because the problem we face in sustaining democracy is that too large a percentage of the population is informed incorrectly about almost everything. So in spite of multiple election audits and dozens of court decisions affirming the integrity of the 2020 elections, Reuters, working with Ipsos, reported that a national poll conducted months after the election still showed in late May of 21 that 53% of Republicans believed that Trump was the true president, and that compared with 3% of Democrats and 25% overall of all Americans. So a quarter of Americans, that's 83 million people, thought that Trump was the proper president. PRI, Public Religion Research Institute, based again on March 21 research, reported that, and this is a quote, a non-trivial 15% of all Americans agree with the sweeping QAnon allegation, this weird one about Satan-worshiping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation. Think about that. Republicans, 23%, are significantly more likely than independents or Democrats to agree that the government, the media, and the financial worlds are controlled by this Satan-worshiping pedophile rumor, fantasy. I don't know what even to call it. Look at the chart. Here's the three questions that they looked at, that they found that the QAnon conspiracy theories strongly influenced the way people thought. That's the result of social media. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is the fourth trend, that this is a physiological issue. I call it the amygdala trend. You can see the picture of the amygdala. It's a little gland about the size of an almond that's deep within the temporal lobe of the brain. And in every species that has an amygdala, including humans, it has the same function. It's activated during periods of fear, stress, or threat. And if there is enough stress, it takes over. Sometimes it produces heroic response that saves your life. But most of the time, it produces a very different, much darker result. Because when this little gland gets stimulated, it overrides rational thought. And that has all kinds of implications. And although it may seem hard to believe to some, the amygdala has a direct impact on American democracy. This is what the people, the oligarchs who fund the Republican Party, know. They fund research that has produced this data. They give the grants to scholars through foundations to get this kind of research. And once they have it, they use it. So, for instance, humans who have overactive right amygdalas are motivated more by fear, anger, resentment than they are by facts. What matters socially is that this response turns out to be highly political. Researchers at the University College in London showed, and this is a quote, greater conservatism was associated with increased volume of the right amygdala. The researchers also found that greater liberalism was associated with increased gray matter volume in the anterior cingulate cortex, a region in the brain that's believed to help people manage complexity. The study also reported that conservatives' brains had smaller anterior cingulates, the part of the brain responsible for courage and optimism. So what we're dealing with here is neuroscience as politics. And we need to understand it more clearly because it is shaping our world. Neurologist Gerard Rees made this point very clearly after having studied this at great length. It is very significant because it does suggest that something about political attitudes are either encoded in our brain structure through our experiences, or that our brain structure in some way determines or results in our political attitudes. You think about this for a minute. This research is telling us that the schism that is tearing the United States apart, in some measure, has a neurological basis that cannot be resolved by reason or facts. So where does that leave us? First, once you recognize that all consciousness is interdependent and interconnected, and you understand that fear is so much a part of the American culture today that it may be arising from a presentment with a psychoneurological consequence, you recognize that alleviating fear, making people feel more secure, making them feel that there is increasing well-being becomes critically important to saving a democracy. Over roughly the past 15 years, a confluence of these social and neurosciences has presented us with research findings that describe this and describe that we need to foster well-being not as some sort of theoretical idea, not as some sort of philosophical concept, but because it is fundamental to having a society that focuses and accepts well-being. And finally, I want to look at two final trends. The first is the white supremacy trend. For the first time in 500 years, since the beginning of the age of exploration in the 15th century, being born white is not conferring automatic privilege. Think about that. The assumption that being born white gives you automatic privilege no longer obtains, and it is driving a large part of the white population crazy. About a third of American whites are completely freaked out by this. The core of the white supremacy movement, white Christian nationalism, is the belief that the white race has been responsible for most of the good things in human history, the great art, the great science, the great thinking, and that whites are inherently superior. It's not in fact true, but it is profoundly important to people who see white supremacy as a critical part of the United States. And that is linked, this white supremacy business is linked very closely to the sixth trend that I want to cover, the Second Amendment trend. Uniquely in the world of developed democratic nations, the United States has a gun crisis that is staggering. As I said in an earlier episode, the leading cause of death for children is a bullet in their body. We have such high death rates from gunfire, suicides, murders, mass killings. Just look at the mass shootings. We've had 501 mass shootings as of the 17th of September, the last time I could get a clear picture of this year. That's a little over a month ago. 501 mass shootings. There's no other developed nation in the world that has anything remotely like that. It's unbelievable. And look at this chart. Look at how this has gone up over the last decade, this increase in gun murders. It has gotten so bad that if you talk to people who live in other countries, they will tell you that their media warns them, and even CNN reported, close U.S. allies have long warned their citizens about the risks of exploring the United States. America's obsessive gun crisis is already impacting our democracy. Over 50% of Americans are now carrying or have someone in the family with a gun. 40% of Americans, over 40% of Americans, are scared to walk down a dark street at night. This is altering our democracy, our society, in ways that would have been incomprehensible 10, 15 years ago. So the question we have is, what are we going to do about this? What lies in front of us if we don't begin to train our children about how the government works, and if we do not make fostering well-being our first priority? The government, the society that you will live in, your children will live in, your grandchildren will live in, is going to be determined in 2024 election by how we answer those questions. What are you willing to do to make that happen? That we make fostering well-being our first priority, and that we teach what a democracy actually is, how it functions, what it's made up of, and that we only elect people who support democracy. The choice is yours and mine. I know how I'm going to vote. I hope this helps you figure out how you will. Thank you.